Okay, so we have those 5 categories. So size of government, judicial independence, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and what was the last one?
Regulation of labour. Can I just add one point, which I think the index was very, very good at, given us some criticism over the years, which is that gender rights are not equal in all countries, especially in area 2, where the property rights. So women, we know in certain countries, have a lot less rights than men. And so some countries were scoring higher on the rankings than they deserved. What the index has done now is to take those areas where women have significantly less rights than men, and they give a punishing score to those countries that do that. And that lowered their rankings in the score overall, which was, I think, a fair correction.
Okay. Well, I'm sure our audience is very intrigued to know where South Africa ranked this year. And I think, I'm not sure if you mentioned this already, but there is a lag in the data because it has to be compiled. So this is 2022 data. So we should bear that in mind when we're discussing this, that this isn't just a snapshot in time right now. There is this lag effect.
Correct. Yeah, they do, because the report is based on other reports, we have to wait for the publication of those reports before we can compile our version.
Yeah, and obviously as a composite report, there is that kind of administrative process to it. Okay, so where does South Africa rank this year, Neil?
Shall I go straight to South Africa? You want the reveal?
Oh wait,
we can. I was.
Don't want to lose the anticipation. Yeah, so maybe we could look at the top 10 before that.
Yeah, I think just general news. If we look at the report globally, 2 countries stand out in having significant drops in economic freedom in 22 were Ukraine and Moldova, and it's good that the Freedom Index picks up these sort of events, these global events happening. And we could see, terrible declines due to the wars that are going on in Ukraine, at least, and the effect on Moldova. The other thing that we notice in 22 is the return or the pickup of freedoms that we lost during COVID. The economic freedom scores globally took a tremendous dip in 2020, especially on things like people's freedom to move. Were terribly restricted. Those were restored in 2022. So we see global freedom has generally ticked up a little bit because of those controls being lifted.
So that's more like a reversion to the mean.
It is a reversion to the mean. That would be correct, yeah. So not much change in the top 10. Hong Kong and Singapore, they swapped places last year, but sometimes the report's values are corrected as better data comes out. So Hong Kong retains top spot this year and reclaimed it last year, where it had fallen second to Singapore. Obviously, it's very important with what's happening in Hong Kong, the freedoms that those people are losing with the imposition from China. So that will be monitored. But Hong Kong and Singapore still rank very, very highly across the board.
And so just a methodological point, sorry, Neil, there's the ranking. How do you rank in relation to other countries? And then there's also the score.
Correct.
But in this instance, Hong Kong's score went down, even though they retained their number 1 ranking or regained their number 1.
Correct. That's right. Yes. But Hong Kong and Singapore score is quite significantly higher than the 3rd place. So they are shining examples, we like to think. Switzerland comes in at 3rd. Then we have New Zealand, the United States, Denmark, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and Luxembourg in the top 10. So I think that's a good smell test for the sort of generally accepted freer countries of the world. Just as a smattering, just to give people a feel for it, Japan would be 11th. We have Germany at 16th. This is in rank order if it makes it easier, but Taiwan at 19th, Korea at 32nd, or South Korea at least. France is 36th, Italy 51st, Mexico 65. And now the BRICS countries, India is 84th, Brazil is 85th, China 104th, and Russia 119th out of 165. So the BRICS countries obviously falling at the tail end in the rankings there. The bottom 10, again, just to get a sort of a sense of it, Yemen, Libya, Iran, Argentina, Myanmar, Algeria, Syria, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, which the EFW score tracked very carefully over the last 10 years and sort of predicted that demise. Yeah, we can.
So, can we just pause there? Because I believe that we're having a few technical challenges. So what I'm going to suggest is that we pause this and resume in just a moment. So apologies to everyone watching at home, but we will fix this problem in due course. Thank you. Okay, brilliant. Okay. So I read the earlier messages, which were saying there were some gremlins, but apparently those have been resolved. So thank you to our producer. Okay, so so that's sort of like a snapshot of some of the high-performing countries. But then there's also the low-performing countries as well, right? I think something that really stood out for me was that Argentina was 159th. And bearing in mind that we've, subsequent to 2022, we've seen the election of Javier Milei, I'd be very surprised if we don't see Argentina rapidly climbing those rankings. So I think that's interesting to see. One can get despondent when you see these low scores, but actually some of these issues are eminently fixable, right? If you just lean towards freedom and use that as your...
And I think that's the value, because we're tracking it over time, we can plot that. We saw Venezuela sliding down the rankings. It would be very interesting to see Argentina go up the rankings and what effect that's going to have on what has been a terrible situation for 50 years for Argentina.
Yeah, and Venezuela is now stone last at 165. We've seen the consequences of that: mass immigration, starvation of people, clamping down on civil liberties, that rule of law point that we were discussing earlier, and it's almost been completely eroded away. Okay, so, and then, before we go into South Africa, what about some of our African peers?
Yeah, Africa's been reforming in the last 10 years, which is quite interesting. We have a shining example, whether we can count them as Africa or not, in Mauritius. I think there's something interesting about Mauritius in the sense that it was a socialist economy, and B, also had a highly concentrated agricultural economy. It's changed that and flipped that around. It became a highly capitalist country and has specialized in financial services and other important export trade with Africa. So it's very much opened up and now ranks 17th in the list, which is very good. And of course, we've seen fantastic results in Mauritius in terms of incomes and so on. Most African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, do fall in the bottom quartiles, so third and fourth quartile, so from sort of the middle rankings down. Kenya is the next most free country before South Africa at 74th. Uganda is at 76th. Botswana is at 80th. Then we sort of have the other East African sets: Rwanda, Tanzania. They've all moved up the rankings slightly. Their scores have improved. Namibia is at 99. Zambia is 103. Nigeria on the Western African side is at 113. Mozambique at 125. Swaziland or Eswatini at 142. Angola at 155th. And our neighbor Zimbabwe at 164th.
Okay, so Zimbabwe just beating Venezuela in terms of
they lost the bottom slot, yeah.
So yeah, that's a very lamentable situation for our northerly neighbor. But yeah, very interesting, looking at a country like Botswana. I mean, if you think of the liberalization that's happened there, the focus on economic performance, growth indicators are a lot more healthy. Quite a different country in some ways in terms of its economy and its demography. But that's a neighbor that's performing quite well. And then you mentioned Mauritius, which is right up there, number 17, which is really impressive. All right, so maybe we should delve a little bit more into South Africa. We are, of course, speaking to you from South Africa, from Hout Bay, the southern tip of the country. So how did South Africa perform this year?
Okay, well, we have moved up in the rankings. The scores moved up slightly as well. So we are on 6.65 as a score. And that puts us 81st out of 165 countries. So in some regards, we may consider that South Africa is smack bang in the middle of average. That we're an incredibly average country. But of course, there's a danger in averages. So, we can explore a little bit the variation in our different areas. But in some regards, South Africa is extremely average. We were placed 85th last year, so we've moved up a couple of places in the rankings. Again, bearing in mind this is from 2022. Some of the restrictions on COVID were released. That helped, but that affected a lot of countries. So we didn't get as much of a benefit, but we can go through some of the changes.
Okay, yeah, well, why don't we delve into that? I mean, before we do that, I mean, do you have any sort of reflections on some of the overall trends?
Yeah, I mean, South Africa's had obviously a unique history. So that it shows itself in the various freedom scores. So in Area 1, for example, our size of government, before 1994, we had a very interventionist government. We had one that imposed enormous impositions on more than half of its citizens. So we've been used to a history of that level of intervention. In the post-1994 era, there was an element of opening up. The government intervened slightly less. Then it clamped down again in the sort of 2010 onward period. So we're seeing a slight uptick now, which is very, very positive. Area 2, the rule of law, is somewhere where South Africa has institutionally done quite well. So just to go back and give you the area ranking. So in Area 1, the size of government, South Africa ranks 115th. So we're kind of at the top of the fourth quartile there. Not very good. Area 2 is the rule of law, and we're 59th. So it puts us above average for our judges, courts, and impartiality and so on. On the sound money side, Area 3, we're ranked 85th, again, smack bang in the middle. We have relatively high inflation compared to other countries. We set a bracket of around 4 to 6%. Other countries can achieve 1 to 3%. But it has been a fairly stable level of inflation. We haven't oscillated around too much over the years, so we get a better score for that. On the freedom to trade, we rank 97th. So we're a relatively open economy, but there's certainly areas for improvement. And on Area 5, the regulation of labour, credit and business, we're not a country burdened by too much red tape. Generally, we score 68th ranking on the list. However, there are certain areas where we are rock bottom, which in two particular areas, hiring and firing and collective bargaining, South Africa ranks worst in the world.
Okay. So, in terms of the importance of this for a South African audience, I mean, why should people watching at home care about some of these measures, and what would you say is some of the key takeaways for South Africa?
Well, I think if we remember, the motivation for creating the index in the first place was to argue for the benefits of liberal, politics, to let people make their own decisions and look after their own property and do those things. And the prediction would be that those would create good outcomes. So what we're looking to do here is to say, if we know that we have economic freedom, do we expect good results to follow? Now, since the report was put together, over 1,000 papers have been produced that use the economic freedom of the World Index as one variable, and then they're using it to correlate with the output of another variable. So the Freedom Index itself is not really recording outcomes. It's recording an input to the process. And what we're interested in is, does economic freedom make a difference across the board? So we've got some results which are in the report this year, but I think make the case that economic freedom is a good force. It's a policy decision that countries make, and what follows are good outcomes. So let's go through a few of them. What they generally do to illustrate the point is that they take the 165 countries and they divide them into quartiles, so 4 blocks. And then you can take the average for an output variable, such as income, for that block. And then we can compare them. Now, if there were no correlation between economic freedom and that output variable, then we would see the same number across all 4 blocks. But if we see significant variation in those 4 blocks, we would have to say that there's some correlation, potentially causation. So one outstanding statistic at the beginning is the income levels. If you are in a country that's relatively free, so the top sort of 25%, your average income level would be about $53,000 a year. If you're in the bottom quartile, those countries' average income is $7,000. So it's sort of 7 times difference in income levels between the free and the unfree countries.
Is that GDP per capita?
GDP per capita, correct, yeah. Now, one of the other key points there is that people concerned about inequality would maybe argue, oh, yes, but that's fine, only the rich are getting richer kind of thing. But that's not true. What they also published in this year's report is what salary do the bottom 10% earn? If you're going to be poor, you care about what level the poor are earning. So in that top quartile of countries that are free, they earn the poorest 10% earn $7,600 a year. In the bottom quartile, they earn $950. So again, something like 12 to 15 times difference in income between, if you're going to be in the poor category, do you want to be poor in a free country or do you want to be poor in an unfree country? And we know which way the migration patterns work. You will live longer if you live in a free country. So you may expect to have a further 16 years of life in a free country than you would in an unfree country. If you're an infant under 1, you are 9 times less likely to die in a free country than in an unfree country. Only 1% of the population experiences extreme poverty in a free country, whereas 30% experience extreme poverty in the unfree.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that goes back to your earlier point. People often will attack capitalist free market economies and say that they're inherently unequal. But I mean, look at the stat that you just gave now. 30% of the population in the unfree countries are living in extreme poverty. I mean, I think that is really a very strong counterpoint to that.
It is. And to my point earlier, that if you're measuring an output variable and it doesn't change in all 4 quartiles, then obviously economic freedom doesn't have much of an impact. And one of those is the percentage of income earned by the poor, or how much poor you generally have. And that's about 3% in all the countries across the board. So whether you are free or unfree, the percentage of people who are poor, it remains relatively the same. So in other words, inequality in itself does not seem to correlate well with economic freedom. Whether you're a capitalist country or a socialist country, the same level of inequality goes across the board. So other factors are at play there.
Yeah, I mean, often in some of these debates, people will say, oh, economic growth is not the only thing. It's not just GDP. And freedom certainly seems to correlate strongly with economic prosperity, but there's also well-being, right? What about other measures like life satisfaction and things like that? I mean,
I think that's the fun of the index. We get a lot of econometricians write papers on economics, and they're studying income levels and growth levels and so on. But there have been some very, very interesting papers on correlating economic freedom with happiness, things like female literacy, environmental concerns. One paper even looked at the number of magazine publications on the set of shelves. You tend to have more different options on a magazine shelf in free countries than you do in unfree countries. In this report, we talk about self-reported satisfaction. People living in free countries are generally 40% more satisfied with life than people in unfree countries. Children are 2.5 times more likely to have to go to work in unfree countries than in rich countries. Literacy is universal in free countries, but in the unfree, only 78% of girls can read between the ages of 15 and 24. So there's a real impact there. Health is 50% better in the free countries. They tend to be significantly more tolerant of things such as gender or minorities, immigration, or immigrants. They're nice places to be. And another one that may be relevant to South Africa is that in the free quartile, countries tend to score 2.5 times less on corruption scales than they do in the unfree countries. That may well be relevant to us.
And again, there's this caricature of free market economies as being fundamentally exploitative, like they want to see children working as chimney sweeps like in 19th century industrial England, right? But actually it's in the unfree countries where children, because of lack of economic opportunity, they have to go and work in the fields or bring in a meager income for their families.
And the value of this report is that we can look to that evidence and see if we can question those assumptions.
And so not only is it more economically efficient or beneficial, but you also have a population of self-actualized human beings who have agency, and who can pursue their own idea of the good life. Okay, great. Yeah, and then literacy, again, it's very beneficial to have a literate workforce, but that's also a path to finding meaning in your life. So yeah, I think this is more than just the economic outputs, as important as those are. I'm conscious that maybe we haven't spent enough time speaking about South Africa specifically. Maybe we could go through some of those, the 5 key areas. I mean, size of government, obviously that's an area where South Africa is underperforming relative to other countries. And I think there is a status bias in South Africa. People see a lot of problems, and I'm sure you've heard it at the proverbial briar. People say government must do X, government must, but it's people who solve problems, not necessarily governments. So why do you think that we're scoring poorly there? And remind our audience what our score was, and what could be done to sort of shrink the size of the state there.
Well, let's start with state spending. So that's area 1A, and we get a score of 4.95 there, which is extremely low. I think that's in the 120 rankings or so on. So the reality is that our government is relatively a high spender, a high taxer, and a high spender. We currently have a relatively high budget deficit, and the debt level that we have is now at 75% of GDP. It's not grossly excessive. There are countries that are worse, such as the United States and even Japan. But it's high for a country of our level of development. And the question of whether we can borrow at the same rates that Japan and the US can is rapidly coming into question. And of course, we would sense that we're at the limit of that. So that's going to restrict the government in terms of further spending. They will not be able to borrow endlessly and continue at these rates. We have very low levels of capital formation. The gross fixed capital formation has been around 15% for the last few years, which is very low. We're not replacing our roads, our infrastructure, our capital equipment. So, that's an area where the government has to make choices between paying salaries and building roads. These are all the policy questions that the government has to have.
And there's a strong bias towards government consumption rather than government investment.
Correct.
So a lot of that's going towards paying civil servant salaries, which are not really value adding.
No, and we can talk to efficiency of that spend as well. So we have a massive procurement program in government that's not necessarily as efficient as it could be, or doesn't get as much bang for its buck as it could. So there's massive opportunity for 10-20% improvement in procurement efficiencies and spending efficiencies. I mean, do we need as many people as we have at certain state-owned enterprises, for example? I mean, there would be enormous opportunities to trim. And that's what the government will have to do if they're going to bring the tax levels down, and the spending levels down is probably more important. And corruption, of course. We lose the tax money we collect if we just pay it out and give it to undeserving.
Yeah, and there are also a lot of perverse incentives, like the procurement system. There's a whole Byzantine list of rules, BEE procurement rules and so on, that essentially get imposed upon providers of goods and services to the state, and that waters down throughout the whole system.
It becomes a big trade-off for the country. We know why it's proposed. The argument is for transformation, but of course, transformation has to come at a price to the general citizenry. If services are going to cost 10-15% more, we have to weigh that moral decision, whether we're transforming or whether we're actually delivering services to the populace.
Yeah. Okay. So what about area 2, the independence of the courts and the strength of the legal system?
If I may just go back, actually, the score I'd like to cover, which was recently looked at in a report, was the high levels of tax at the top level.
Oh, right. Yes.
It's a score we do very poorly, and again, the score is 4.5. And it's quite interesting. So in 2017, the government decided to tax the rich and raised the top tax rate from 41% to 45%. Now, ostensibly, this was a revenue-raising opportunity or decision, and also to reduce inequality. Well, it achieved the latter, but it did not achieve the former. So in a recent study, they looked and analyzed the very, very good data that SARS were able to produce. And what they found was those people that were earning more than 1.5 million rand a year went from 41 to 45%. It's 87,000 taxpayers in South Africa. So it's a relatively small amount of people. Those 87,000 paid 100 billion in taxes in that prior year.
100 billion rand from 87,000.
Just from 87,000, which is 0.6% of the taxpayers. What is interesting is that in other countries, the top taxpayers will be getting their money from other sources than a salary. In South Africa, they're mostly salaried employees. They're not receiving large chunks from dividend income or the idle rich, if you like. These are skilled salaried people. Now, in that particular report, they found that although the salaries didn't change too much, the discretionary income that came through bonuses or commissions and so on was reduced significantly. And it was so significant that SARS collected 6.5 billion rand less than they were expecting. So raising the tax rate produced significantly less revenue than they were expecting. And one of the other important findings in this report was that the output from the firms that those taxpayers worked at also fell. Now, that was unexpected. It fell by as much as 5% in some cases. And the way I'd like to portray that is if the tax bands are similar to the days you work in the week, the top tax rate payer has some choices. On Monday, he kind of works for himself. On Tuesday and Wednesday, he's paying 25, 35, 40%. So by Friday, when he goes to work, he knows he's going to pay 40% on that Friday morning tax, so on the income. What the SARS did in 2017 was raise the tax to 45% for Friday afternoon. And the taxpayers decided to knock off and just not work.
Stuff it, I'm going home.
Stuff it, I'm going home. So we have to, I mean, economists will know references to the Laffer curve, but this was a dramatic demonstration of this in practice, where South Africans' revenue authorities specifically hit a targeted group, and those people decided not to play. And it's not that they avoided tax, they just decided not to work. If this is a massive disincentive to encouraging our very productive people in the economy, then it backfired. And I think that's a lesson that's been learned. A bigger lesson for the politicians, of course, is that opportunity no longer exists. There are no more rich tax people to pay in South Africa. Everybody's got to come to the party, and that's going to have a dramatic impact on policy. We also, a report that came out recently from the Centre for Development and Enterprise was one on state-owned enterprises as well. I don't think, well, it has been commented upon, of course, that SOEs have a massive impact on our economy, but I pulled some stats here that are dramatic. I mean, just PRASA, the Passenger Rail Authority in South Africa, they were doing 54 million rail trips a month in 2008, 54 million. That's dropped down to 1.7 in 2022. I mean, it's a complete collapse of the passenger rail service.
But I'm willing to bet that the spending or the capital allocation that's gone to PRASA has not gone down.
Probably the same, yeah. Our ports and rail are run by the government SOE. So our three major ports are ranked in the bottom 10 out of 405 in the world. There is much talk going on at the moment about what we can do with the ports and Transnet, and whether there's elements of privatization or liberalization, different ownership strategies within the port and different operations. So that's quite exciting that we're having those conversations.
Yeah, and we at the Free Market Foundation are very strong proponents of political decentralization, so of ownership and also administration. And we've been arguing that the ports and rail should be governed by local authorities, by cities, municipalities, and provinces where appropriate, and also by private actors. So I think we need to heed some of these lessons as well. We can't just carry on doubling down on some of these mistakes. We've had now multiple decades of failed state-owned enterprises, and there's a strong case for deregulation and privatization. Absolutely,
and I think any nation has to go through a point where it has some experience. And, if we look at the state-owned enterprises, the key element for all of those is a monopoly of their local markets. So Eskom was the monopoly generator of electricity in this country, and we had 12 years of load shedding. So although people are saying now Eskom has saved us from recent load shedding, but really what we need to look at is the private contribution that has happened, with over 4 gigawatts of electricity being generated now by private solar roofing and companies generating their own electricity since Cyril, with a pen, signed the monopoly away from Eskom on generation. So that's a tremendous experience that we've had of what level of investment and solution providing that can come through if private elements are allowed to enter markets that have previously been reserved. The other one we can look at, which is still it's still on the books, is that the post office are the only company allowed to deliver parcels under 1 kilogram. Now, sort of honoured in the breach, but we take a lot on Amazon and all of these great providers. We really do not need such a monopoly.
Yeah, and I think underpinning that kind of vast ownership by the state of these resources is this false idea of a natural monopoly, that only the state can provide parcels through the postal service.
Correct.
That's an anachronism. I mean, you just mentioned all of those firms that do an equally.
It feels like the 60s, right?
Yeah.
I mean, only this week we heard announced that both Google and Amazon will be building nuclear power stations next to their server farms. I mean, they need that level of electricity with AI and the various other things. Now, who 30 years ago would have thought that private companies would be building nuclear power stations? But it's not a natural monopoly necessarily that the government should be providing.
Yeah, and just a quick point on that. We are going to be releasing a paper on privatization of state-owned assets that's authored by Dr. Christoph Klein, who's one of our other associates. And so do keep a lookout for that to be released shortly. All right, so yeah, we've got quite a bit to get through here, so maybe we can jump into the judicial system and private property rights.
Sure. We haven't seen any changes in the score recently, but we've had a lot of threats. So we can talk about the level of crime in South Africa, which still remains exceptionally high. I mean, if any improvement was made here, our score would improve tremendously.
And that's very low, the police and crime indicator, that's 2.52. I mean,
we're at the bottom of the rankings globally there. So, and it's an unfortunate reputation that South Africa carries. So I wouldn't say it's low-hanging fruit, but it's an area that really would need the top attention and would yield fantastic results across the board, of course. It's one of the most important areas. I mean, people are not going to invest and do things if they're going to lose them to crime. And these extortion rackets that we're seeing really needs to be, put down very, very, very early.
We do quite well on military interference, I see.
Yes. We haven't had any military coups of late, so we score quite well on that ranking. Judges, I mean, we look to see the impartiality of the judges and the court system. So there's a little bit of a debate going on right now in terms of certain appointments. But generally speaking, South Africa has done relatively well in this area. We hope it would continue. Obviously, there are threats like the expropriation of property bills. They haven't come to pass yet. They still haven't managed to cross a constitutional hurdle. But that obviously remains a threat, but potentially with the government of national unity, that threat is sort of reduced at this point.
Okay, and I have a strong interest in the third category, which is sound money. And, I think this is not unique to South Africa, but we have been seeing debasement of currencies around the world, excessive measures taken by central banks and by treasuries to inflate the money supply through quantitative easing and so on, largely related to some of those significant deficits that you mentioned previously. COVID obviously played a massive accelerating role in that. So in terms of South Africa's score, we're 85th in the world, so pretty much in the median there. And we do fairly well on the money growth side. I think the SARB has not been as tempted as other central banks to print money at will, but inflation is still a problem. And you mentioned that kind of 4 to 6% range that's been fairly consistent, but that's a consistent debasement of people's purchasing power. Imagine if you had 100 eggs and you took 6 of them and you smashed them on the floor. That would not be a very good outcome for you, and you're doing that every year, so there's that compounding effect. And I think that affects the poor even more. Wealthy people tend to have other assets that can also appreciate with inflation, like property or equities and so on. But poor people are dependent on their income.
They save cash.
Yeah. And so they really feel these changes in inflation quite dramatically.
I point out to everybody the rule of 72, which is when you have a growth number like that, 5 or 6% debasement in this case, divide it into 72, and that's how many years it takes to halve its value. So if you take a worst case, do the maths easy, 7%, 7 into 72 is approximately 10 years. So if you've been saving your money for 10 years at 7% inflation, your money's halving. Wow. It's a very, very powerful effect very quickly. So we're setting target ranges of 3 to 6%. There's no real argument that having a certain amount of inflation is good for growth. Really, the only decent value should be 0. I mean, and in fact, potentially lower than 0, because why aren't prices falling? Why aren't we getting richer? Things should be cheaper. So the Federal Reserve, sorry, not the Federals, Reserve Bank's Kenyaho has argued for a lower band, and I think he should be fully supported. I mean, trying to move us to 1 to 3, but the Constitution says that the job of the Reserve Bank is to preserve the value of the currency. So that should be 0. Any corruption of it is a corruption of the value.
Yeah, look, I think there's a strong argument to be made for free banking in South Africa, to not even have a Reserve Bank. I mean, I think the Reserve Bank, relative to other government institutions, has been well managed. There's an institutional culture there. But it is seen as a political prize to capture, and that's why you've seen the likes of the radical economic freedom fighters explicitly say they want to nationalize or take control over the Reserve Bank.
There's no reasonable reason for the rand to continually degrade every single year at a consistent rate. It should hold its parity. That's their mandate.
Yeah, and I see we don't score very well on one of the measures there, which is foreign currency and bank accounts.
Correct.
So enabling people to hold other kinds of currencies, freeing that system up would put less pressure.
Yeah. Correct, yes. Again, in a country where you've got 10 or 15 or 40% inflation, that can be dramatic. And we've seen countries who've moved to other things like bitcoins and so on because they're not able to have other currencies. If you are able to move your currency from your savings from your rand account to your dollar account, obviously it puts a lot of nice pressure. We don't, we've struggled to have those opportunities in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, interesting on the Bitcoin point, I can't recall off the top of my head how well Nigeria scores, but the Naira has suffered from incredible debasement in recent years. And that's prompted a flood of Nigerians to go towards harder money like Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is officially outlawed in Nigeria, and yet Nigeria is in the top 10 countries worldwide for Bitcoin adoption, right? So, if you don't embrace economic freedom, people are going to seek it out themselves. All right, and what about Area 4? We're 97th on the ranks there. This is freedom to trade internationally. That's not a very good performance for us. That's, I think, the second worst out of the 5 areas, our worst performance being 115th on the size of government. So, yeah, what's going on there in terms of our trade profile, Neil?
Well, we like foreigners visiting us on holiday, but historically we've not enjoyed them coming in to do any work or to pay any taxes here. So now, thankfully, we've had some excellent developments in the past month where their visa regime has been revisited. It won't show up, obviously, in these reports because we're a couple of years behind, but I would hope that we would see an improvement in the score 2 years from now when we track what's happened recently at Home Affairs. So the regime that's now been put in place looks fantastic. We have the opportunity of bringing in digital nomads from around the world. We're in the 21st century where people are roaming the world with their laptops. And if you stay longer than 6 months, you start paying tax in South Africa. I'd love to think, as you can see the weather here in Cape Town, it's such a lovely place to be. So why not bring your laptop here and pay tax here? But that's great. So we're opening the doors there slightly. We are an open economy. We do trade with the world, but we do tend to pick our local industries that we want to protect. That harms the local consumer and also the local manufacturer who pays more for certain inputs like steel and so on. There was a recent report by XA Global Trade Advisors that was quite critical of the fact that for the 3,500 import tariff codes that we have, few of them have been revised in the last 20 years. So policies that may have been relevant 20 years ago and are no longer valid, we still have those tariffs impacting industries that no longer exist potentially. So we need to have a little look at the tariff regime, which is one of the scores that we are very bad in, because we have a high deviation of tariff rates. So we are cherry picking industries and trying to protect them. So we need a public policy debate about whether that's relevant, how quickly they review. Now, in their defense, the International Trade Administration Commission came out and said, well, look, we can't review 3,500 codes every year. We don't have the resources. Well, maybe a different solution is that they sunset automatically after 5 years. I mean, maybe we can defend an industry if that's the public policy for a period, but that those protections fall away. And by that time, that infant industry should have been nursed, right? But we don't need 20-year-old industries who are still living at home. It's time for them to stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, and I mean, as we've seen with some examples like tariffs in the steel sector, I mean, a lot of those costs end up being passed on to consumers anyway, right? And you don't necessarily get the benefit of greater competitiveness either, right? So I'm very critical of tariffs. I mean, I think they usually are the result of special pleading by industries.
Oh, without a doubt. You know, it's a rent. And in fact, in the ITAC report that was the response, they actually mentioned that explicitly. This is a rent paid to industry. With the explicit understanding that they have an obligation to pay taxes, hire people, do transformation and so on. But is there any evidence that that's taking place? So that is an area that we need to look at. The other thing that is often not mentioned is that the impact of these tariffs is not always as targeted as they believe it to be. We as the consumer choose what it is that we buy. So if you take the sugar tax, for example, the ostensible motive is that we want people to drink less sugar or eat less sugar and so on. But for any given consumer, they are faced with an increased price for Coca-Cola or whatever it is, but they may choose to buy that Coca-Cola anyway. Then what we see is that they've got less income to spend then on other things. So even if the tax is imposed on one particular industry, if consumers choose to continue to spend with that industry, they're spending less with other industries. So what are they? What is that impact? And we don't know. So we could find that a tariff or a tax that's imposed on a certain industry actually has harm all the way else, rippling its way through the economy.
Absolutely. And I think something that's dragging our score down there as well is capital controls. That's 4.81.
Correct.
So, yeah, you know, I think that's another hangover from the old days. I think it was 1961 that those capital controls were implemented.
Correct.
To prevent capital flight. But actually, when you make it difficult for people to take their money out of the country, you also dissuade them or disincentivize them from bringing it into the country. And so I think removing those would be a very effective way of improving the liquidity of capital markets in South Africa.
I mean, I understand, you know, the gradual process that we needed to do when coming out of 1994. But we want foreign investment, but we recognize that dividends are then going to go back out of the country. What we're not recognizing is if South Africa takes its capital out and invests, those dividends will come back. Now, over 20 years, we could have allowed a certain amount of capital to go out into the world, and then that would now be paying dividends back to South Africa. But with extreme capital controls, we do restrict at the margin, potentially, those investments. And of course, that's limiting the portfolio that South Africans can own globally.
Yeah, as an individual, you have an allowance of, I think it's 11 million rand or something, which probably means that it's fine for most people. But like you say, at the margin, it does have an impact. The likes of a Mark Shuttleworth, who tried to, have these struck down by the courts unsuccessfully.
And then left the country.
And took his brain with him.
His money and brain with him,
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, area 5. So that's the regulatory profile. I mean, we love making rules and regulations in South Africa. And I think there's this problem of second order effects. Like, you don't know how, you might think you're solving for one problem, but you're creating 2 or 3 other problems down the line. What are some of your reflections there on us?
Well, overall, South Africa doesn't do too badly. We sort of fall into the average red tape basket, but there are 2 areas which we score particularly badly in, which is the hiring and firing practices and collective bargaining, which obviously impacts some very concentrated industries important to South African economy. But of course, it's the spill effect that it has to all of the sort of smaller players in those industries who found themselves bound to contracts that they didn't agree to. And we don't have the flexibility built into the economy then that can make that economy dynamic. So I think that's a key area that they've got to look at. General red tape, I mean, that's just a good thing just to be removing. So the presidency is looking at that, and there are opportunities to remove red tape across the board. Hiring and firing practice is a difficult one. 1994, they implemented quite a dramatic change in the law in terms of recognizing what a fair practice was in labor law. And certainly, given the history, there was some relevance to that. But I think we've, again, probably just overshot. A lot of employers will know that, you're often taken to the CCMA and have to fight fights that really shouldn't have to be fought. Perhaps a simple change would be that loser pays. It might just dissuade people from taking sort of, poor cases to the CCMA, wasting everybody's time, including businesses. So some balance has to be struck there, but it is unfortunate. I think we've overshot at this point.
The Free Market Foundation has long advocated for a job seekers exemption certificate, which would enable individuals to voluntarily opt out of some of these rules. And we suspect that this would be an incredibly popular measure.
And given our unemployment levels, it seems obscene to have a very, very restrictive labour environment.
Especially for young people who are desperate for work, wanting to get their foot on the ladder, on the first rung. And then, so actually what these rules end up favouring older, more established workers at the expense of the young who, if they don't get that first opportunity, effectively get locked out of the labour market for their entire lives. All right, well, I think we're nearing the end of the live stream. But I just wanted to say to our audience, if you're interested in delving into the data a bit more deeply than what Neil and I have done today, you can go to the Fraser Institute website. We'll link to that in the description below. And you can download the actual data set, and you can also read the summary report, some very interesting essays and analysis pieces that are included there from some of the international partners of the Economic Freedom of the World report. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of take a step back, Neil, and reflect on where South Africa is in terms of our overall economic freedom score.
Well, I think looking at this year's results again, we don't have a great brag in terms of having moved up significantly or moved down significantly. We've pretty much stayed the same. And to a degree, for the last 10 years, we have been reporting the same ranking year on year. Now, that in itself tells a story. In other words, reform is not taking place in South Africa currently, or we're not picking anything up yet. So I think the message is that we would hope, given the electoral change that took place this year, is that we will start to see movement in different areas and hopefully movement in the right direction. So reform matters. I mean, one of the other results, or one of the chapters in this year's report is the scale of reform, how quickly you move, and potentially sequencing of reforms. And one of the numbers that they found in the report was that if you make a 1 standard deviation move in your economic freedom score, you'll be 10% richer in 5 years.
Wow.
So this is a significant number that should excite people. So where we sit at the moment is unmoving. If we keep doing the same, we should expect the same results. So we present this report, the evidence that it offers in terms of more freedom leading to better outcomes. We hope that policymakers will look at this, see where South Africa is right now, evaluate our low-hanging fruit, and see if we can make those policy changes that will really make an impact on South African lives.
And reform is not going to happen on its own. We need to push for it. We need to make the case for it. You also need to recognize that there are significant vested interests that are going to not want to reform, and they're going to push back. So, there are some difficult trade-offs that are going to have to be made. And I think if this government of national unity is to succeed, it's going to have to really embrace some of the principles that we've discussed today and lean into economic freedom. And in furtherance of that, I'm very excited to announce that the Free Market Foundation is going to be embarking on a very significant project called Liberty First, which seeks to give expression to the principles of economic freedom that we've discussed today. And over the next 5 weeks, we will be releasing 5 special reports. We'll be doing live streams on each of those over the next 5 weeks. where we will be delving into some of the policy prescriptions that we are recommending to policymakers and to society at large to really unlock growth, prosperity, and individual freedom in South Africa. So do keep an eye out for those launches. We're going to be very busy over the next month or so. But I think that's all the time that we have. I just wanted to say a very special thank you to Neil Emerick. You're a great friend and partner of the Free Market Foundation.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate your insight and analysis and your knowledge of this very important index. So thank you very much from all of us at the FMF.
Thank you.
And thank you to you, our audience. If you have any thoughts on today's live stream or reflections that you want to share, please do leave those in the comments section. We'd love to engage with you further there. And also don't forget to hit like and to subscribe to the Free Market Foundation on our various platforms. That's it from me, David Ansara. Stay free.